Yes. Okay. So, okay. So hi everybody and welcome. Welcome and thank you for choosing to join us today as we continue to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So we're gathering here today in this digital space, but we are being hosted by the University of Michigan-Dearborn. The University of Michigan-Dearborn sits on the territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa. And with this, we begin our program with the humble beginnings of an acknowledgement that honors the indigenous people of the land on which the university currently resides. We do this to acknowledge, to honor, and to uplift the first people who stewarded these lands in the past and their descendants who continue to carry on their legacy in the present. To the members of indigenous communities, please know that you are not forgotten. So thank you. Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Gerard. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am the Race, Ethnicity, Intercultural, and Intersectional Identities Program Manager with the Center for Social Justice and Inclusion at UM-Dearborn. And I'm so excited that we can host a Detroit gem, Tawana, Honeycomb, Patty. Tawana's critique and analysis of the various entry points of allyship are really crucially relevant during this time in which racial injustices are being brought to the forefront of public discourse. But before we introduce our speaker, I would like to just cover a few housekeeping items. So first, please note that the Q&A feature is active, so feel free to post your questions there. I know there were some questions, like you were able to submit questions in the registration, but couldn't find those, so apologies. And if you could go ahead and enter those into the Q&A. As we're talking, at the end of Tawana's presentation, we'll try to cover those. So that's the first thing. And then the closed caption feature is active. So there should be a CC at the bottom of your screen there. So just choose that if you would like to use that feature. And then thirdly, the session is being recorded. We're not going to live stream, but after we will be posting the video to either the CSJI's website or the university's YouTube. So you'll be able to find it there. And then if you're having any technical issues, we'll try to assist you. We're not super tech gurus, so you can just send the question. The questions are anonymous, and we'll try to work with you. But please bear with us. I've been nice to my computer, so hopefully technology karma is working in our favor. Okay, so with that, I'll introduce Tawana. So Tawana Honeycomb Petty is a mother, a social justice organizer, youth advocate, poet, and author. She's intricately involved in water rights advocacy, data and digital privacy education, and racial justice and equity work. She was born, raised, and calls Detroit her home. Tawana is a former director of the Data Justice Program at Detroit Community Technology Project. She's a co-founder of Our Data Bodies, a 5-person team concerned with the ways our communities' digital information is collected, stored, and shared by government corporations. She's a non-resident fellow with the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford PAX, a convening member of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, and a former fellow and current anti-racism facilitator with Detroit Equity Action Lab, DO. Tawana is also the founder of Petty Propolis, a Black woman-led artist incubator primarily focused on cultivating visionary resistance through poetry, literacy, and literary workshops, anti-racism facilitation, and social justice initiatives. Petty Propolis organizes an annual art festival and artist retreat in historic Idlewild, Michigan. She's the author of Introducing Honeycomb, Coming Out of My Box, The Petty Propolis Reader, My Personal and Political Evolution, and Towards Humanity, Shifting the Culture of Anti-Racism Organizing. Honeycomb is also the founding member and editorial board member of Riverwise magazine. She's a past recipient of the Spirit of Detroit Award, the Woman of Substance Award, the Women Creating Caring Communities Award, the Detroit Awesome Award, the University of Michigan Black Law Student Association Justice Honoree Award, and was recognized as one of Who's Who in Black Detroit in 2013 and again in 2015. She's also a 2018 Wayne State Center for Peace and Conflict Studies Peacemaker Award and a 2018 Certificate of Special Congressional Recognition and a 2020 Art Matters Fellowship Award. Um, in addition to her social justice and community organizing work, she performs and presents across the globe. She has appeared on several television and radio programs, and her works and writings have been featured in numerous publications. So with that, Tawana, please take over. And I'm so glad you could be here. So thank you so much.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. So I'm going to get right into it, and I'm going to share my screen and walk you through everyone through sort of a PowerPoint. I've had to kind of get used to PowerPoints in this age of Zoom when I'd much rather be there with you all in person. But so bear with me, give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. And although Gerard has given you a very lengthy bio of mine, I should also add that I am now currently the National Organizing Director at Data for Black Lives. And you can find out more about that organization at d4bl.org. So, without further ado, I'd like to bring Dr. King into the fold very early on. And one of my favorite quotes of his came from his Time to Break Silence speech, where he was talking about the war in Vietnam. And this portion of the speech says that we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing oriented society to a person oriented society when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So I am born and raised in Detroit, as indicated, and that comes with a particular type of perspective. So I'm 44 years old, and for my entire life, Detroit has suffered essentially under one pervasive, dominant, negative narrative that Detroiters are hopeless, helpless, non productive citizens, violent, and just basically non contributory. And the reason why I want to center Detroit in this discussion is because the city, when I was growing up, was over 90% Black, and the city now is over 80% Black. And so we're looking at a city that is predominantly Black in a state that only makes up about 14% Black residents in the state. So you can imagine that has a particular type of conditioning that happens when you grow up, surrounded by segregated cities in a segregated state with living in a predominantly Black city. And so, what's the impact that narrative has had on Detroiters? I'm going to take you through a couple of instances where narrative has been particularly powerful, and has also shaped policy. So, this first quote that I'm going to lift up is from an article called "Is It Time to Change the Narrative About Detroit?" And it was listed in Smart Cities Dive in 2007. And this write up came about at a time when folks were starting to look at Detroit as kind of a viable place to reinvest, really a place to one of the terms that a lot of people use is gentrify, but I don't think that that term goes far enough. In thinking about the displacement that happens when a place that was historically disinvested in and abandoned becomes now intriguing for other demographics, predominantly white demographics, and then the investment follows with displacement of longtime residents. But a lot of writing started to happen when Detroit started to look like a city that folks might want to re engage with. And so this quote is: "The standard narrative for Detroit has been about a bankrupt, vacant, decaying, post industrial wasteland, an environmental, social, and economic disaster. Detroit has been the quintessential shrinking city, the poster child for everything that has gone wrong with the post industrial Midwest." And that was Cade Benfield. And as I indicated, that was in 2007. In 2014, Paige Williams penned an article called Drop Dead Detroit. And it was about L. Brooks Patterson, the late Oakland County exec, who, in this, as you can see in his title, they called him a suburban kingpin who is thriving off the city's decline. And so I want to take you to some direct quotes from, I'm going to take you to some direct quotes from L. Brooks Patterson after I walk you through another instance of dominant negative narrative. In 1977, a film called A Fistful of Yen had a scene in it where a person was being taken to suffer a punishment. And so there was this evil drug lord who was capturing and punishing everyone he considered to be enemies of his. And when he got to the person he considered to be the worst enemy of his, he decided that the most drastic punishment that could be offered was to take this person to Detroit. And as he's saying, take him to Detroit, this person is being dragged out of the place screaming and kicking, saying that he would rather be killed than to be taken to Detroit. And this was in 1977. So I want you to think about that. I was born in 1976. And so for as long as I've been alive, these types of pervasive, dominant, negative narratives have been overarching theme of what Detroit is. So you can imagine the psychological impact that has on a child growing up in a city where media, music, film is really creating a situation where you can't be proud about where you've come from. So here are some words from the late L. Brooks Patterson about Detroit when he was interviewed by a reporter. I used to say to my kids, first of all, there's no reason for you to go to Detroit. We've got restaurants out here. They don't even have movie theaters in Detroit, not one. He went on to say, I can't imagine finding something in Detroit that we don't have in spades here, except for live sports. We don't have baseball, football, and for that, fine, get in and get out. When I asked him, this is the reporter, when I asked him how Detroit might fix its financial problems, he said, I made a prediction a long time ago, and it has come to pass. I said, what we're going to do is turn Detroit into an Indian reservation where we herd all the Indians into the city, build a fence around it, and then throw in the blankets and corn. Now, this might seem like just, someone's kind of bigoted commentary about, a city and big deal, right? People have their opinions, racially biased opinions are still opinions. However, L. Brooks Patterson's very powerful and was able to regulate not only water resources, but transit resources, housing resources, and financial investment into the city. And so, if you have high ranking officials who have this sort of analysis of a city that is predominantly Black, is going to have a political impact on whether or not that city is able to thrive. So, what happens when narrative dictates data creation, use of policy, and what are some of the real life impacts of that type of analysis when it comes to whether a city can be invested in? We called it at our data bodies a looping cycle of injustice. So if you're not seeing the residents of a city as fully human, and in this instance, predominantly Black city as fully human, then you start to have reactionary policies and you don't look at those residents as folks who are worthy to be invested in. So, as an example, for extreme poverty, you do things like ramp up surveillance as a reaction instead of more street lights and more investment and more lucrative businesses and grocery stores and recreation. You just kind of contain the problem, the areas that are considered problematic. And these things lead to broken families. And in addition to that, you have massive water shutoffs. I mentioned gentrification and devastation, right? And so I'll tell you that prior to the pandemic, the median income in Detroit was $26,000 a year. And since COVID-19, more than half the residents in the city have lost their jobs. And on a larger scale, in the United States, more than 140,000 jobs were lost in December, and all of those jobs were lost by women, and all of those women were women of color. And so that is something that we really need to think about. And so I mentioned the reactionary policies that happen to a city. If you're not looking at a city as fully human, then you're not going to start to look at solutions. And when I say you, government officials, law enforcement, and other entities that have a hand in how the response can be applied to a city. And so instead of resourcing these communities and reducing quality of life crime, so that reducing quality of life crime by investing in quality of life issues and reducing quality of life issues, there are things like ramped up cell phone tracking, face recognition, massive water shutoffs. There had to be an executive order issued to stop water shutoffs at the height of a pandemic, when we knew that the reason why COVID-19 was spreading as rapidly in Detroit as it was because tens of thousands of residents did not have water. Detroiters were overtaxed by $600 million. That has not been rectified. So a lot of residents lost their homes for taxes that they didn't even owe. Um, we're also looking at gunshot detection. Instead of investing in communities, recreation, food, housing, and all those other things, we've now ramped up to have gunshot detection surveillance, which not only captures what could possibly be a gunshot, but it also captures the sound in a 3 to 6 mile area of any resident who is talking at the time. And in addition to that, it deploys law enforcement into those areas that may or may not have gunshots. And so you can imagine, if law enforcement is looking for a criminal, the way that they might respond to community members who are likely going to be innocent when they engage with law enforcement, which means that the interaction is going to be considered resisting. And so we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing people falsely arrested and then responding to those false accusations by resisting not being arrested, and that has not led to a good situation, especially for predominantly Black communities, Black men in particular. So here's another instance. This map is showing you surveillance cameras that have been added to Detroit under Detroit's Project Greenlight program. So this is where it stood in December, and that is only because the program took a break for COVID, but it is going to continue to ramp up and add these surveillance cameras to literally every aspect of the city, and these are monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by law enforcement through real time crime center headquarters. And they have access to face recognition. There are also surveillance drones. I mentioned cell phone tracking, surveillance traffic cameras, and so many other surveillance technologies, which is really creating a sort of a social credit system in Detroit, which means that uh, if you look at China's social credit system, it regulates the behavior of the residents based on surveillance. And I'm taking y'all through a lot of things around data extraction and surveillance because really, if you look at the cities who have stood up, resisted, and won their resistance to these systems, they have all been predominantly white. So, what are some of the impacts of that type of surveillance, particularly face recognition, biometric data abuse, and misidentifications? So, these two people, Robert Williams and Michael Oliver, were falsely arrested using face recognition technology and accused of crimes they did not commit. Because of this accusation, Michael Oliver lost his home, his job, his cars were repossessed, and he is now suing the city. They are actually both suing the city. And Detroit boasts the first known cases of misidentification in the country using face recognition. There has now been a third case identified in New Jersey. Face recognition has been proven by numerous studies, including out of MIT, that it is racially biased and that it does not properly identify darker skin tones. Yet Detroit has spent over $30 million to leverage this type of program using Project Greenlight and face recognition. So, what are some of the community members been saying about how these systems have made them feel? So, when we started our data bodies several years ago, Project Greenlight was just now ramping up. They had not bought into face recognition yet. There was only 8 or 9 cameras, and community members were still feeling this sort of pervasive, insidious surveillance, and they were feeling that these systems were communicating with them for the benefit of extraction or to kind of limit their ability to move about freely and have a livelihood. So I'm going to read some of the words from community members out of their own mouths. The changes I would like to be the changes I would make would be to have data that is intentional and targeted and centering people in the middle of those decisions. So data would be created for the people and with the people as opposed to on the people and against the people. I mean, your face is not even your own anymore. Your face is being captured by cameras. I'm often concerned how my orientation will play a role in someone denying me my liberty at some point in the future. So, how are Detroiters responding to these dominant negative narratives, this pervasive surveillance, this inequity around water, housing, and other policies that have really prevented them from, to a large degree, on making a living and being more contributory members of society? Some examples is currently what's called a Detroiters Bill of Rights. Residents in the city have tied in with 2 city council members, Raquel Castaneda Lopez and Mary Sheffield, to create a Detroiters Bill of Rights to challenge and try and amend the city's charter in order to be free from discrimination, to have a right to affordable water, to have a right to safety that does not include mass surveillance and face recognition, to have a right to quality and affordable housing, housing that is actually based on the income of Detroiters. As I indicated, the median income in Detroit was $26,000 a year pre COVID-19. Since then, half the residents have lost their jobs. So that means massive evictions are on the front. Right to environmental health. We have some of the most polluted zip codes in the United States in Detroit. Right to recreation, just places to play, vibrant places for young people to play and have something to do and have green space so that there is just areas for young people to thrive and be connected with the land. Right to access and mobility, not cracked up sidewalks and other places where people with disabilities can't move about freely in the community, as well as transit systems that work, that are vibrant and can get community members who have had to travel outside of the city to go to work. I mentioned earlier, L. Brooks Patterson was instrumental in removing some of those rights to that type of viable transit system. A right to basic needs and quality of life. So, trying to get some of the resources that have inflated, as an example, the policing budget, which is over $300 million, and pulling some of those funds, which is not individual officer salaries, but some of those funds that are leveraged to send officers to things like mental health situations and evictions and other incidents that we don't need law enforcement for, and adding those resources to other programs within the city that will raise the quality of life for residents. There's also a campaign called Green Chairs, Not Green Lights, where community members are saying, come back to the front porches. Let us see each other. Let's not watch each other. What does it mean to be neighborly? What does it mean to make sure that our neighbors have the things that we need? How do we look out for one another? How do we see that child that is waiting for the bus get on the bus for school or walking to school? How do we see them to safety? How do we see that elder who is coming in late at night and make sure that they make it into the home? We know that surveillance ain't safety, and we want to remove this notion that targeting, tracking, monitoring, and surveilling people creates safety. We create safety. Young people were going door to door all throughout the pandemic. knocking on their neighbors' doors, taking Riverwise magazine, wearing their green chairs, not green lights t-shirts, telling community members that they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they don't want to be watched. They want to be in community with one another, and they want to make sure that they can address each other's needs. They want to restore the village mentality. So how can you respond? All of this is anti-racism work, right? We're mentioning, that's why I chose to lift up Detroit as an example, because it is a predominantly Black city, and it takes a lot of confidence and courage to stand up for a city like Detroit, to say that those residents in that city deserve to be seen as fully human. It's sort of a test case for your humanity, to see whether an ally can shift from allyship, this kind of opting in and opting out that happens, and move towards collective liberation or co-liberation, and see your humanity tied up into the humanity of the residents of Detroit. And so I want to lift up this quote by Dr. Vincent Harding, which I had the honor of knowing. He was a dear friend of Dr. King and also his speechwriter. And he said, "We can't sit back and celebrate Martin King and ask, when will there be another like him? No, no, my dear young friends. We must join our voices with that blessed poet June Jordan and demonstrate that we are the ones we've been waiting for." So I also want to talk about the opting in and opting out that happens when we want to try and challenge anti-Blackness. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the different levels of opting into anti-racism work. And so solidarity, as an example, is typically this kind of notion of, what happened to you is wrong. So I feel you and I'm with you. Allyship is like, what happened to you or what is happening to you is wrong, and I have some guilt about it. I'm guilty. I acknowledge that I've benefited from this system that you've been impacted by, and I feel guilty about it. An accomplice is kind of like, what happened to you or is happening to you is wrong. Tell me how to make things right. And this is when you see non-Black people or other people of color kind of lean in on Black people to kind of guide the conversation and guide how to be anti-racist. And so you'll see collaborations in Black Lives Matter and other instances, which is really good and very powerful. However, if we want to move to the next level, which is collective liberation, we need white people to also acknowledge that they've been impacted by the system of white supremacy. And so in co-liberation, it is essentially saying, I want to right the wrongs of the past and the present for not only you, but for my own humanity. And so, what are some of the ways we can have application of all these things that I named? What's the praxis? And it is to study history. It is to have a knowledge of self. It is to connect with ancestors and to actively interrupt these systems. And I want to say ancestors because a lot of times what I've learned is when I ask white, well meaning folks who want to be anti racist, who are some of their heroes in the movement and the struggle against anti racism, they don't know anyone who looks like them. And that's problematic. If we're going to stick and stay in this movement, we have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and see that we can be modeled in this movement. There are white people who are anti-racist. There are white people who are abolitionists. There are white people in history that you can channel and tap into and build off of that legacy to move anti-racism forward and to challenge anti-Blackness. And so what happens when you do all those things, right? We move in from that looping cycle of injustice and not seeing people as fully human into the path towards justice, where instead of jumping to surveillance, we're looking at well lit streets. Like we know that there's research that says that just having street lights in communities can reduce crime. We know that instead of over policing a community, maybe we have neighborhood block clubs or safety teams where community members are looking out for one another and not just tracking and reporting each other in things like neighborhood app and considering everyone suspicious, but actually just looking out for each other and seeing that needs are met. We move from disinvestment to community investment. We move from poverty to equity. We move from broken families to livable wages. We don't challenge things like a minimum wage for folks to make sure that they can feed their families. We actually think that a livable wage is good. Affordable water instead of water shutoffs. We move from devastation to thriving communities. And instead of gentrifying neighborhoods, we advocate for affordable housing, and we reduce closed schools by infusing viability into existing schools. And so here are some resources I want to share, and I will get make sure that Gerard has these slides and links to these things so that they can be sent out to you all afterwards. But this is a kind of breakdown of how you can kind of start to make some steps from solidarity to allyship to co-conspirator or accomplice, and then what types of deep thinking needs to happen when we're moving from co-liberate from co-conspirator to co-liberation. And you might slide down some of these occasionally. We're not all going to be everywhere at the same time, but the goal is to always be trying to think about the ways that white supremacy, the system of white supremacy, spatial racism, systemic racism, systematic racism, and all the isms have dehumanized us and prevented us from reaching our full humanity. And so this is a book that I wrote called Towards Humanity, Shifting the Culture of Anti-Racism Organizing. It is a mini curriculum, and I am due to release the expanded edition in a couple of months. But it is really a good start to have those conversations. One of my comrades would always say, get 5 of your friends and come together and bring your dreams to life. And so just have a discussion with a small member of your friend, a small collective of friends through this book, and this can help you to deepen your dialogue. In addition to that, I co-authored with the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy a toolkit for centering racial equity throughout data integration. And this is for anybody that is handling any kind of data within your organization, in your schools, information that you have for young people, students, in the workforce. How are you looking at that information about other individuals, and how are you applying it to the decisions and the policies that you make? Are you centering racial equity throughout your thought process? This takes you throughout that process from beginning to end at all stages of integration. In addition to that, I helped to co-author Technologies for Liberation Towards Abolitionist Futures. And this is us thinking about all these technological systems and other systems and how they create reactionary policies in communities of color and tend to disenfranchise and further marginalize. So that is what I have to share for you all today. I can be reached on social media at Combs the Poet. That is my Twitter handle. Be nice, be kind. I'll engage with you. Otherwise, I do have a block feature. So be kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tawana. We appreciate you. So I have had the honor to actually have Tawana as a facilitator. I was a fellow of the Detroit Equity Action Lab Racial Equity Fellowship. This we was Deal Rona. That was our that was our little nickname. So I actually experienced this presentation. That's kind of how we even got Tawana to talk about this subject. Um, so Tawana, I guess a question I have, I guess it's like 2 questions. First question is, so we kind of focus on anti-Black racism, which is obviously very important, but do you think that this model can be applied to other movement spaces as well? Um, Maybe we could just speak to that just a little bit. You muted.
My apologies. I think that it's imperative that this model is applied to other spaces. I think anytime we're trying to make an equitable um, situation, we need to start off with what it means to be human, and we have to be able to see ourselves to some degree in the shoes of other people. Our struggles are different, But that's why I say we really need white people and other people of color to see the impact that the system of white supremacy has had on their humanity. Because one thing that I've learned is if you can't see yourself in the struggle, no matter how much of a good person you are, you're really only going to opt in and opt out when it becomes convenient for you. Until you see how this system has impacted your humanity, then it won't be systemic. And so I think that's why I gave those other toolkits. Those toolkits talk a lot about data, but there's so much in there. There are glossaries in there. There are ways to walk through different steps of how to engage in certain types of discussions. It gives a little bit of a historical framework. And so I really think that in the society that we're moving in, we're all on Zoom. We're all on social media. We're engaging with technology in various ways, and you can create harm for other people if you are not centering humanity and racial equity within that process.
Amen and thank you.
You're welcome.
Gigi, did you have a question? You muted.
Yep. So we do have
Also introduce yourself. Hi.
Hi everyone. Sorry, my name is Gigi. I go by they and she pronouns. I am the LGBTQIA and intersectional identities program manager, and I definitely echo and I love to sit in sessions like this. I think diversity and inclusion is something I hold very near and dear to my heart. I'm from New York. I grew up in a low-income area that is now facing a lot of gentrification. A lot of my family and friends are being displaced and dishoused because of that shift and that change. And I think that just really powerful to hear a different perspective on what anti-racism work really looks like and what allyship really looks like. And I think for me being queer, I sometimes question what allyship is even for me and for what I can do as someone who is feminine presenting, someone who is white, and someone who is often very safe in most places I go to. So I so appreciate just being able to sit here and to learn and to just soak it all in. So thank you. We did just have a question, but it was answered. So I don't know if anyone else has any questions that they would like to submit.
There's another question, but I also have a question. Or I guess it's not really a question, but Tawana, do you think you could uplift Lily Mendoza's work around ethno-autobiography? Because I think that is also a really useful tool for self-exploration, for finding your ancestors, for connecting to abolitionist or anti-Black movements that kind of existed or have existed throughout time. So I don't know if maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah. I'm gonna blank on the title of the book that she
I'll try to
always
find it.
references. Thank you. But Lily Mendoza, there's a lot to out there that you all can check into. She's a phenomenal person. You can find some videos on her presentations, but she really does believe in the notion of connecting to your ancestral roots, not only to tap into those revolutionary spirits and abolitionists and other folks who might be in your ancestry and direct lineage, but also the harm. How do you go back and heal some of those levels of harm and that transference of DNA that we have to consistently struggle with? Just as a lot of Black folks are carrying over the DNA and the impact of slavery. You have white people who are carrying over DNA of white supremacy, and maybe even slaveholders and those other sorts of traumas that you carry in your DNA. But one of the ways you can counter that type of DNA is by tapping into that other ancestral legacy that exists. Maybe it's not in your direct bloodline, but it's important to be able to look in the mirror and see people like you who are committed to the struggle against injustice, a struggle against anti-Blackness, a struggle against white supremacy. Whiteness is an ideology, it's a political ideology, and Blackness is a response to that political ideology. And I know that for myself and many others, Black people that I know, we would love to live in a world where you don't have to use Blackness as a defense mechanism to defend against the ideology of whiteness. And so, the more that we become humane, the more that we struggle against these systems that have dehumanized us, the greater we will become. And so the cause, right now in the moment for unity that do not talk about racism, that do not struggle against anti-blackness, that do not have deeper dialogue around white supremacy are disingenuous and will have us keep repeating this sort of trauma. And I think that many of us, many more of us than there are that don't want to live in a better society. And I also would like to say this. One of my greatest fears is that all this attention to what is happening with the Capitol building and Republican Party is going to similar to what happened with racism in the North and the South, right? Where the North kind of got a pass, and folks were like, well, all the racists are Southerners who live in the South. And the meanwhile, in the North, systemic racism was moving up throughout institutions, and all, and folks were suffering tremendously in the North. And so I don't want us to paint a broad stroke in thinking about how we challenge racism and thinking it's just like a right issue, or it's a left issue. It really is an issue with us having a poverty of the spirit, and we need to be respirited, and we need to tackle these ideologies that dehumanize us across the board. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. The questions are rolling in, so just feel free to cut me off if we ever get to a part where we're going over time. We have a few that are kind of similar, so I might just read through them really quickly, but they all have a similar theme. So the first is that the person asking the question is a white teacher at an all-Black Detroit high school. They see that their work through the lens of empowering their students. What should they be aware of or focus on as a teacher in the city to value my students' humanity? Similarly, the next two questions ask about how white folks balance collaboration with respecting the fact that there are huge blind spots, and strategies that you suggest for the balancing act of it. And then kind of in the same tone, someone saying that they have experienced a lot of white / non-Black folks showing up to anti-racism work, but maybe taking up too much space, or leading from a place that is disingenuine, or maybe taking away from really what the message should be. So it's a little layered.
Yeah. So I'll start with the first question regarding being a white educator in a with predominantly Black students. I believe that's what it said. Yeah. The narrative, I can tell you, as someone who had many white teachers growing up, and one of the most important things was to re-infuse worth in young people. As I indicated, the narrative is so pervasive about Detroit. It is so pervasive that it really is going to take someone really investing in countering that narrative within the academic institutions, because inside that space they're not learning adequate Black history or history about folks that look like them, and definitely not enough to counter what they're hearing about themselves in media and movies and other images. And so if they're not getting it at school and they're not getting it in society, where then do they get it? And so one of my late mentors, Grace Lee Boggs, would always say, there's a difference between schooling and education. And so we really need more educators really thinking about the ways that we can create humane conditions within the classroom. And I want to say this, and this is always challenging. But the academic institutions are some of the most abusive, honestly. It really teaches and fosters this sort of uh, individualism and competition, and it puts a lot of Black children who are not getting the resources that they need it really disenfranchises them to a great degree, and it teaches penalty and punishment consistently. A perfect example is I was a child who always thought that it was important. I was being taught at home that it was important to help people who were in need. But then when I got to school and I saw one of my classmates struggling and suffering, I was punished for supporting them. And I really think that we need to transform the ways that we create classrooms, and foster this sort of, leaning in and sharing, and not look at it as cheating, but it really is a benefit to having young people nurture each other and create an environment where everyone can succeed and not having us race to the top. If this moment in the country has taught us anything, the American dream is not going to ever be a reality for most people. And so, how do we reimagine a new dream where we are all lifting each other up together, and that a child who sees their next peer struggling and wants to help that peer is actually celebrated and not criminalized? And so, just things like that, creating a nurturing environment that doesn't individualize us, doesn't have us sitting so separate, doesn't have us competing with one another. School is the most perfect place to have education really be enforced, it reinforce our humanity. And so, I'll say, how should white folks balance co-liberation and taking initiative instead of relying on Black labor with respecting the fact that we have huge blind spots. Everybody has huge blind spots. We've been miseducated. Nobody's getting adequate history about who Black people even are. Not Black people, not white people, not other people of color. And so we're all out on this mission to figure it out. And so I think that the more that we study who we are, study examples of who great contributory human beings in different races are, in addition to studying who we are, who you are as a white person, it's very important for you to know some of the folks who a perfect example is to look at the Rainbow Coalition, the original Rainbow Coalition. That's an example of a multicultural institution that was really lifting up the different ways that Blacks, whites, other people of color were joining together in the struggle, in the movement. And so there are these models of how you enter into movement and don't step on one another, don't disenfranchise other voices to prioritize and center yourself, and how you tackle anti-Blackness. It's okay in Detroit to center Black people. It's a predominantly Black city, and a predominantly Black city that has suffered tremendously and is really still suffering tremendously. But if you do collective liberation work, it really does benefit Black people for white people to know who they are, and to not just be going into kind of it can kind of feel like a fetish. It can kind of feel like you're under a kind of in a petri dish if the person coming in to support you in the work does not genuinely know where they fit into the work and does not genuinely believe that dismantling the systems is going to humanize them. And so, I'm running on, but I want to make sure I kind of get to folks. Um, can you say more about collaboration, white/slash non-Black folks showing up in anti-racism work and also not taking up too much space in Black Center? Yeah, I mean, if you feel like you're taking up too much space, you probably are. Tune in, listen to yourself. Nobody going into a space and anticipating your response without deeply listening to the people who are there to talk about the ways that they've been disenfranchised by the system is going to be most important. But you also need to do your own work within your community as well. If you're running to my community to challenge racism and letting racism fester in your community, I'm eventually going to have to deal with your community because it's going to end up over here with me. And so racism is not a Black person problem. It's something that's been imposed on Black people. And so we have to have the courageousness to address that within our own communities, as well as doing collective liberation work. Um, we read about and discussed Project Greenlight in the class. Uh, Curious about how you interpret community support for Project Greenlight, how widespread is support and pro. I interpret community support for Project Greenlight as an impact on the dominant negative narrative that has happened to Detroit. If you teach a community to fear themselves, if you teach a community that there is no viability in that community, and that everyone in the community is a criminal or somebody waiting to harm you, then you're going to champion surveillance as a response, instead of true safety, which really is turning to one another, which really is making sure your neighbors have livable wages and viable infrastructure and recreation and housing. And we're hoping Detroiters Bill of Rights is going to be a awesome opportunity to roll into some programs that will address the quality of life issues, that create a situation where we think surveillance would ever be a solution. You don't need a lot of imagination. Drive 15 minutes outside of Detroit and see thriving communities, and you don't see flashing green lights. You see resources, you see grocery stores, you see recreation, you see green space, you see housing. You see things that everyday human beings deserve the right to have. And I'm sorry, I just ran through the questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
uh,
perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
How can I best communicate the idea that my humanity is tied to yours without centering myself and subsequently whiteness? I try to center humanity, but I often get nervous that I'm going to end up coming across as I suffer too and making it about me. Look, listen, I tell folks all the time, I would much rather you say, I see that until we dismantle the system of white supremacy and whiteness, we can never fully be human. I would much rather you be struggling through the best ways to say that than doing nothing at all. And there is no perfect answer to how we go about this, but not doing anything is going to cause a whole lot more harm to people than fiddling through the best ways to address the circumstance. And I'm hoping that the resources that I share out are going to help you to have these conversations. And so, if you're not comfortable having that in a multiracial space just yet, make sure that you're having those dialogues with your family and your friends, because that's another thing. If you minimize racism's impact in your community, then you'll have to have less conversations with Black people about the impacts of racism, because you will have stopped chasing the arsonists and started, I mean, you'll have stopped putting out the fires and started chasing the arsonists, if you know what I mean. And so also, it really hasn't allowed for, in your conversations with your own community, it can be really easy to talk about how it hasn't allowed for your full humanity. We can see the suffering. I don't know where everybody politically stands, but if 70 million people voted for Trump as an example, I don't believe that every single person that voted for Trump is a racist. I believe that a lot of folks feel like their needs are not being met, and the system of white supremacy is the same system that created school shooters in predominantly white schools than it has does when it creates violence in communities and Black communities. And so when people feel othered, they don't feel seen, they don't feel like their needs are being met, and they don't have what they need, sometimes they don't respond in humane ways. And that happens in every community. We don't talk about the ways that it happens in the white community, the ways that we talk about in the Black community, because racist narratives. But it's time to have those discussions if we're really going to move this country forward. How do you suggest white folks can make sure that we're shifting towards consistent praxis instead of opt in, opt out allyship? Check out those resources. We're going to be wrapping up soon, so I'm going to try to take these really quickly, but just check out those resources. It's really going to help you to start having those conversations. And if you can start off having it with one person at a time, I'm not trying to get everybody on here to jump into having a global movement right away. But one of my comrades always says that it is better to be an inch wide and a mile deep than a mile wide and an inch deep. And so we want to have a movement of deeply rooted anti-racist organizers, educators, mothers, fathers, children, aunties, uncles, cousins, who are really having these deeper dialogues, asking these deeper questions. And that will go a long way with having the ripple impact that we need. I don't know if you all know about mycelium under the earth, but that is how you spread and deepen a movement and make it more systemic and sustainable. And I think I have time for one more question. My apologies. What advice do you have for holding organizations accountable to impactful anti racism goals and committing to a path towards justice? I often feel a tension between orgs that are meaningfully making progress and those that look for quick wins that don't get to the root of the problem. How do we effectively measure progress? I really do think that the toolkit for centering racial equity throughout data integration is going to be a godsend for you. Walk through a chapter at a time. It gives you some examples of like, this is what's going to happen if you aren't moving forward, and you'll be able to look back at it and go like, this isn't really, we haven't made any progress on this. We might want to revisit this. I'm a big fan of toolkits and resources to check back in on our progress. I think it's really easy to say, it's really easy to send out a statement, it's really easy to put something in a policy, but if you don't have a mechanism to go refer to, if you don't have a mechanism for tapping back into your progress and seeing if you made any leaps and bounds since you decided to take on an anti-racism lens, then you won't know that you've done the work. And so those toolkits and those resources are going to be very, very helpful for you. And political education goes a very long way. We all need to be studying. We need to be studying history. We have to study Dr. King beyond his I Have a Dream speech and look at some of the other speeches, particularly his later speeches, the last 3 years of his life, where he's really having some honest dialogues about some of the ways that even his ideology has changed towards how we tackle anti-racism. And I think I can do this last one. Uh, what are some of the things white people can do to resist what will likely be an increased surveillance state after what we saw on January 6th, knowing that this increased surveillance will certainly be disproportionately applied to people of color? You have to speak out. It was very disheartening to see so many people volunteering all of their, becoming like these individual sleuths and detectives and sending out so much information to the federal government. Now, I'm not a person who is out here committing criminal activity or anything like that. But I think that there needs to be some sort of conversation about how we create a situation where we can have a deeper dialogue about the impacts of reactionary policies, particularly surveillance. And I think we know from 9/11, we know from other situations in this country that whenever there's a situation that happens, policy is ramped up and then deployed into communities of color, and they are left to suffer the consequences of that deployment. And so I would say that we really have to be courageous in our questions and our comments. We have to be courageous in the discussions that we have with our policymakers, and we have to apply history to the impacts that these situations are having on these communities. We can't just mouth anti-racism as a a theme, a yearly theme or an annual theme. We have to really apply it to our procedures and how we move about in society. And so get in touch with your legislators. That's going to be very, very important. We're really going to need support with pushing forward the Detroiters Bill of Rights as an example. There are some state legislation or surveillance that you can get behind. Rashida Tlaib, the late Isaac Robinson had policy on face recognition that is now going to be picked up by another legislator. There's going to be so many opportunities for you under the Biden administration or any administration, even the Trump administration. There were opportunities to push for these particular policies. And I'm really hoping that folks get more involved with responding when we see reactionary policies abuse communities of color. And so that is my time. Um, Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Tawana. My name is Sharia Carter. I'm the director of the Center for Social Justice and Inclusion. And we just want to thank you for choosing to join us this afternoon. And thank you to those who are able to stay. We hope you found the content of this program helpful for your own personal journey towards realizing a racially equitable society. Again, this program has been recorded and we will upload it to our website for the remainder of the semester. And we just ask that you please support Tawana and the amazing, amazing, amazing and necessary work that she is doing. Also, please check out our MLK Week of Events website to find more programming opportunities being presented by the University of Michigan community. And please enjoy your evening. Thank you all so much.